the PLA is not the one making a decision on whether China is going to invade Taiwan. It will be a political decision made by Xi Jinping. The PLA needs to provide the answer of can we do it or not, right? And they do not want to go to Xi and be like, no, no, Chairman Xi, we can't do this, right?
Russia-China relations and their implications for, well, everything. To discuss, today I have Bonny Lin, director of the China Power Project at CSIS. She previously spent nearly a decade at RAND. Bonny, welcome to China Talk. Always great to have another titan of the China podcasting world on the show as well. Everyone should check out Bonny's China Power podcast. It is really great. Xi, what did he know and when did he know it?
That's a really, really good question. And I'm not sure I definitely know the answer, but based off of my conversations with Chinese interlocutors, both Chinese academics, but also some of the Chinese officials that we've interacted with, I don't get a sense that China really had, the full picture of Russia, what Russia intended for Ukraine. So a couple of data points, right? So what they've told me is that when in mid-February, when China was observing what was happening in in Ukraine, and talking with their Russian counterparts in Beijing, many of them were hearing from their Russian counterparts in Beijing that they didn't think that Putin was about to invade Ukraine, or if Putin did, it was not the large-scale invasion that we're currently seeing now. It would be at most a limited operation just focused on eastern Ukraine. Other data points, for example, in terms of what China did was evacuation of its citizens, relatively very late evacuation, and the fact that in the early evacuation, China encouraged the citizens to display the Chinese flag and then quickly decided that was not a good idea. All of these just seem to suggest that, China didn't really quite know the full extent of Putin's ambitions. China likely had an indication, and Xi Jinping likely thought that there was a possibility, but they probably didn't know it would be as large and as widespread and as beyond eastern Ukraine as what we're seeing right now.
Bonny, what was so interesting in those early days, you saw stories in Western media of Biden administration officials telling officials in Beijing, look, we have all the goods on Russia. We know exactly what's going to happen. Please listen to us. They're doing it. Do whatever they can to stop them. And my sense is that, the officials in Beijing trusted their Russian interlocutors, many of whom were probably not in the circle of 4 people of trust that Putin had. And bought the line that Russia by and large was saying in those weeks before the war, that in fact it was not about to invade.
Well, Jordan, I think that's a really good point, and I still see that today, right? I feel like one thing that's important when looking at how China assesses the situation in Ukraine is that China is probably likely to give Russia more credit and view whatever Russia does more positively, and whatever fault the United States and West has, from China's perspective, it will be magnified from their end. So in many ways, what we saw very early on in the Ukraine crisis was, despite the fact that we were sharing really good intelligence with China, China was completely discounting it. China was viewing that as U.S. attempt to basically divide and drive a wedge between China and Russia.
Which is not wrong, but yeah, did not clearly resonate in the way that that they might have hoped down at Langley.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that from China's perspective, hopefully what they learned from that is that the United States has relatively good information and ability to be able to tell when a country is set on invading one of its neighbors. So when China looks to Taiwan, hopefully one lesson learned that China will have is, well, maybe the United States might be able to tell if we're really preparing for an invasion. And hopefully that adds a little bit of deterrence as China thinks about Taiwan or use of military force in its periphery.
It's interesting thinking about that sort of implication, though, because I'm not entirely sold that that's the takeaway. Clearly, look, America has these really fancy satellites and they can see all the planes and tanks being put on the front and whatever. But, the fact of the matter is in 2012, 2013, the Chinese government, which had an incredibly successful purging of American intelligence assets in in the Chinese leadership. And you've seen stories by Peter Martin and others of late talking about the Biden administration's frustration in not necessarily having a real pulse or high level access or those sorts of like sensitive sources that could really help inform what at the end of the day are political decisions. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, they have the troops on the border, but right before then, everyone was convinced, oh, they're just doing some big exercise to like help their negotiating position. And, the difference with the Putin administration is like, a lot of people don't like him, and a lot of people were not necessarily bought into doing this war, which would make it much easier for intelligence officials around the world to find folks to give them the goods and tell them exactly what they thought was happening, because those people were trying to help the West stop this war from happening in the first place. Now, I think sort of drawing that line to that scenario, all the way back to sort of whether a similar dynamic would happen in the case of a confrontation between the mainland and Taiwan has a number of logical leaps I'm not necessarily completely sold on.
Yeah, and what I said is that was the takeaway that I hope China takes. I didn't say that was a takeaway that I think necessarily China is taking. But I guess a couple of things. If China is closely observing what's happening in Ukraine, it should see that the Russian invasion has caused domestic pushback within Russia, right? So
Yeah.
one thing that we will need to see China do is really prepare its population for a Taiwan invasion. Right now, I'm not exactly sure if the Chinese population is ready for an invasion. I think rhetorically they're ready, potentially, based off of, the censorship that we're seeing. But one area that we might see China do is shift a lot more of its legitimacy from potentially economic development to nationalism, and really, really messaging at home that sustained economic costs for unification with Taiwan is needed. We haven't seen really that messaging yet. We've seen the messaging about why unification with Taiwan is important and how that's in China's interest, but we haven't seen and as the public, you should be willing to take some economic costs.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Every once in a while, she says something around Zhejiang on protracted struggle, right? But it's, and I think all politicians, they want to lower expectations a little bit, and you're seeing Biden do this right now, being like, look, this is Putin's inflation, this is Putin's tax, and you don't want to have people's hopes too high, so when there are struggles, they don't just throw it back on you. But you're right, Bonnie. I think they're like getting people really willing to endure the type of sacrifices that the Russian people are currently having to do based on sort of elite policy decision making is not something that I've seen at all in the cards. It's more like it's more on the lines of like, one of another points that you put in your in your testimony to Congress of like self-reliance is really important and we have to work really hard and invest in this, not necessarily that like, we're gonna have 40% inflation tomorrow.
And I would add, like, I think you have a really good point that there are potential countermeasures and ways that China could try to, even if China believed that U.S. could have good intelligence on some of its indicators and warnings prior to invasion, there are ways that China could try to make it more difficult for the United States, right? One way could be sort of doing what Russia did, which is have a large military exercise and make it unclear whether it's a military exercise or it's actually the precursors to an invasion. So if China did, for example, multiple military exercises and started having a pattern of a lot of large-scale exercises, it could become difficult at some point for the United States and Taiwan to figure out, is this another major military exercise or is this actually a preparation for invasion? But if China was to do that, that would be a relatively costly way to try to hack its invasion by having multiple large military exercises. Another way could be trying to just move a lot faster, right? So even if there are indicators and warnings for China's preparation, there is still the geographic distance and the need for the U.S. to be able to project our forces there. So one thing that China could do is try to move a lot faster in Taiwan and maybe bring more assets to bear in the early phases of a Taiwan conflict.
Yeah. So since we're on the military story, Bonnie, what is your take on to what extent Russian military struggles should cause both the PLA as well as, PLA watchers around the world to update their priors on the, combat effectiveness of the Chinese force.
My hope is the PLA, no, my hope is the PLA does watch it and introduce some doubt in their assessment of their own capabilities. Also, some doubt in terms of in terms of what they might assess to be Taiwan's ability to resist. But I don't know if that is exactly what is happening. What I do see and granted that what we're seeing in terms of the Chinese
Very early,
publications
yeah.
are only, it's very early, but it's also potentially censored, is that there's a lot of lessons that the PLA is learning from Ukraine. And what I worry is that the PLA sees this as, okay, maybe, this can show that we're weak in certain areas, but now we're going to address these weaknesses. Or in areas that we're more uncertain, we're going to double down in investment, double down in training, and double down in exercises, and make more certain that we could do this if called upon to do it. Because as you understand, the PLA is not the one making a decision of whether China is going to invade Taiwan. It will be a political decision made by Xi Jinping. The PLA needs to provide the answer of can we do it or not, right? And they do not want to go to Xi and be like, no, Chairman Xi, we can't do this, right? So they will try to address all these efficiencies. The question is also on Xi's part, given what Xi is seeing in terms of Russian military capabilities, does he still have the confidence that the PLA is as capable as they tell him it is, right? Because it did seem like Putin thought his military was that capable.
Yeah.
And what we're hearing from some of the Taiwanese assessment is a lot of the same problems that plagued the Russian military, as well as the flow of information from the Russian military to Putin. We could probably see those problems also within the Chinese system.
Yeah, totally. And you wonder to what extent, because at the end of the day, that's something that like Xi needs to personally internalize, right? It's not something that like the system can solve.
Right.
Because when you have one person who's in power for this long, this is what happens. There's no way to kind of get around it in any structural way. I do want to stay on the sort of updating military priors thing, because the Chinese armed forces has a history of watching wars abroad and trying to sort of take lessons and update. You saw this post Desert Storm. You saw this after the first and second Taiwan Strait crises. There is like clear, plenty of books which have sort of documented this this trend. So it'll be really interesting because I think you're right, Bonnie. We're probably not going to see this for the years from now when you see sort of like different acquisition strategies and new strategy documents. But the extent to which that they see the parallels are going to be really interesting to follow. Of course, an amphibious invasion is very different than a land invasion of like an absolutely enormous country. So there are limits to the parallels that can be drawn.
Yeah, and so some of the ways in which it's really different isn't just the difference between a land invasion versus an amphibious invasion. It's also the way in which China has traditionally planned its a Taiwan invasion, which is to occur very rapidly, hopefully in a matter of weeks, right? That would and with very little indication and warnings beforehand. That's not how the Russian invasion occurred, right? The Russian invasion took a really long time to. It started off with military exercise, right? And those troops were amassed outside of Ukraine for months before Russia actually invaded, which actually created a significant time for the West to be unified and develop its sanctions. So what I'm closely following and tracking to see is, if there is Chinese assessment that the strength of the sanctions, as well as how unified the West was contributed in any way by the amount of lead time they had to debate this. Well, if they had, only a week to react or just a couple of days to react, would that be the same set of sanctions? Would it? And are there Chinese assessments that as events have accelerated and escalated in Ukraine, is there more Western unity, or have we seen from the Chinese perspective less unity, more debate in the West on what to
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
against Ukraine. Or sorry,
Yeah. I mean,
against Russia and Ukraine.
at least from my perspective, I think the answer is a clear yes. And I would be shocked if you weren't seeing, this sort of new U-24 or whatever it is, also having sort of sidebar discussions on like, look, what would be our deterrence package in a Chinese scenario? And one would hope that this would cause Beijing to think twice about just how painful this could be. Though, decoupling with Russia is something that the West, the world has shown, or the liberal democratic world has shown it's been able to pull off with, okay, maybe like 0.5% of hit to GDP growth and like 2% inflation. I guess Gucci can sell, there are sort of like a few firms that are particularly more hit than others. But doing the same thing in the Chinese context is, double digit, immediate double digit inflation, shortages, and just real and like deep disruptions to everyday life around the world, far beyond having to pay more when you fill up at the pump, which I think is something that policymakers both in Beijing and around the world recognize.
Yeah, that's something probably Beijing is trying to bank on, right?
Yep.
The fact that countries are so much more dependent and interlinked with China will deter them from either participating in the sanctions or at least modulate what they're willing to suffer with respect to sanctions on China.
Yeah, and you point out in this testimony, Bonnie, that like the flip side of developing self-reliance for the Chinese government is also increasing global reliance on it. And oftentimes it doesn't, that sort of piece of the puzzle isn't quite reported. It doesn't get as much play in mainstream media, but it's in all the speeches. Not in all the speeches. It's in most of the speeches, and it is a sort of subtle undercurrent to all of this decoupling conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Hey folks, Jordan here. Just wanted to let you know that I've also been running a newsletter for 4+ years. It's called China Talk. You can find it at chinatalk.substack.com. If you listen to this show, I think you'll like it. chinatalk.substack.com. If you'd be interested in supporting the show and also are sick of hearing me interrupt your show to ask to support the show, please consider supporting China Talk via Substack or Patreon. Patreon.com/ChinaTalk or chinatalk.substack.com. Would very much appreciate your support.
For your troubles, you'll get an ad-free feed.
Thank you so much.
So let's bring us back closer to the present. I laid out. I sent you a piece that I wrote with some colleagues at Rhodium a few days ago, where we laid out like the three paths for China when it comes to its Russia policy going forward. The one which is probably most likely is the sort of muddle through scenario where you see kind of current trend lines continuing. The Chinese government doesn't start sending tanks over, but also doesn't start really aggressively criticizing the the Russian government for its actions in Ukraine. But there are, outside chances that we can have Beijing's policy break either aggressively in favor or aggressively opposed to Russia. So I'm curious, Bonnie, what do you think it would take for Beijing to really change its tune? And maybe pick one, and we'll talk about sort of like the indicators and implications, and then go on to the other.
Sure. Just for context for those who don't have Jordan's awesome paper right in front of you, the three options are rebalance toward the US-EU position, muddle through with deliberate blinders, and double down on support for Moscow. So I think the current Beijing's position is somewhere between the last two. So it's somewhere between muddling through and doubling down on support for Moscow. So why I say it's between both is so I view Beijing as trying to portray itself as taking a neutral path, but it is basically in the most important aspects of their policy or their activities towards Ukraine. It is very clearly tilted toward Moscow. So that's why it's somewhere between your top two options.
If you were sitting in Zhongnanhai, like, would that be what you would be telling Xi to do? I mean, is the idea of a collapsing Russian state and sort of this alliance kind of falling apart really, really all that scary?
Um, I think it would be from China's perspective. What we're hearing from the Chinese interlocutors is is that Russia has some of the longest borders with China historically. Um, China's had to worry about the defense all across those borders. And if China has to worry about that again, that would require quite a bit of investment and would take away from what China views as its actual main threat, which is what they view as the United States, given what they view as a much more aggressive U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as us working with our allies and partners from their perspective to expand militarily and potentially form blocs to counter China. So from their perspective, they really do need either Russia as a friend, but preferably Russia that is not only a friend, but also in some ways strong and strategically able to push back and help them push back against the United States, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also potentially elsewhere globally.
Yeah, it's funny that that's the line, is like, we're worried about a rest of borders. It's like, man, the Russian army, that would be light work for you guys at this point. I mean, if you can't figure that out, I wouldn't be thinking about messing with Taiwan anytime soon.
So I don't mean to say that their worries are only about the borders, but it's also about the concern. Would be quite similar to how they think about North Korea, right?
Yeah.
With North Korea is they're worried that with a North Korea collapse, given North Korea's possession of both nuclear weapons and advanced capabilities, what would that type of instability and unrest mean for right next to China? And imagine that being Russia. That's just so many times worse given Russia's size and Russia's military capabilities.
Yeah. I mean, it happened in the 90s, right? And I don't like, aside from like communism being somewhat delegitimized, I don't did sort of the Russian Federation's foibles and challenges over the course of the 90s have a major impact on China? I mean, maybe, like, I can't imagine the oil would stop flowing regardless of what happened to Russia domestically. I mean, maybe it's a sort of just like we just don't want to see autocrats fall type thing.
I think it's a little bit different, right? Like what happened to the disintegration of the Soviet Union was clearly a domestic issue, right?
Yeah.
But if, for example, China decides for your first path to work with the West, the United States, and that somehow contributes to Russia's collapse, I think from Russia's perspective, or Moscow's perspective, it wouldn't view China as, a neutral country. It could significantly increase antagonism between the two neighbors. So there's a lot of questions of, given the fact that Xi and Putin have this strengthened relationship from the February 4th statement, and if Putin did ask for Chinese support and China said no, I think that would be viewed as much more than, just Russia, the Soviet Union collapsing on something. It would be our friend was not there to help us, and that would build up more resentment and antagonism, and China could have a not friendly Russia by its border.
Sure, that's a good point. Though not like that state would be in any position to cause too much mischief. Coming back to the the deep the real long shot here, which is Beijing changing its tune. I mean, is it? I don't even think it's chemical weapons. I feel like it might have to be a sort of a nuclear weapons, which is something that would change the dynamic. I'm curious, Bonnie, if you have any thoughts on what, if any, sort of tripwires would really really cause Xi to think, because I mean, we have seen like a shift on North Korea policy over time, right? It's not like Beijing has sort of always been completely fine with just craziness coming out of Pyongyang. And maybe there is a certain point where they just get fed up with this and think that there's that a new strategy needs to be taken.
Yeah, and I would go back. So in terms of Beijing's red lines, I think, if you had asked me this question 2 or 3 weeks ago, I probably would have been a little bit more optimistic in terms of maybe it was the chemical weapons that would be the red line. But now, as I'm seeing Beijing double down on its relationship with Russia again and again, including the recent Wang Yi statement from his meeting with Lavrov. It seems like China is quite set on this. So when I think about what are scenarios in which China may actually shift its position, I think you have to put on sort of your Xi Jinping hat and think about it from Beijing's perspective. And it might not just be how Russia acts. It might be how Russia acts and how the West responds. So, for example, in the case of Putin uses a nuclear weapon, right? So how does the West respond? If we go nuke Putin, I think China can make the case, well, I don't know. Yes, he did start it, but I mean, that's the case they're making in the Ukraine conflict, right?
Yeah.
Like, yes, Putin started, but look at the Russia.
Yeah,
the
look at these
Western
freaking NATO jerks. They're contributing to the war.
Right, exactly. So I think that the only way that, Beijing could really see a break in this narrative of where they always view the Russia, or they give Russia some credit or some, more slack, and don't really give the US or West any slack at all, would be if Russia makes a tremendous and horrific move and the United States and NATO would basically don't retaliate in kind. And then Beijing's like, oh, well, what Russia did was really bad, and what the West and NATO did was not. And I just don't see us doing that, right?
Well,
like that
yeah,
would have significant implications on our own deterrence and how we think about how to respond to Russia.
Yeah, I was gonna. So I haven't had a guest to bring this up to, but this is the sort of horror moment that's in my head, is like, if you're Biden and like a tactical nuclear weapon goes off on the outskirts of a Ukrainian city, like, what the fuck do you do? I mean, it's I don't know. What RAND paper should I read?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't actually followed any of the recent RAND papers on this. And as you know, it probably takes a while for RAND publications to come out. So you'll probably see the deep research motivating the RAND paper next year on this issue.
So speaking of RAND papers, I just wanted to like allude to something I found deep in your archives, Bonnie. You wrote this. I think the first thing you wrote after your PhD thesis was this: lessons from blunders in military blunders in history, which like I'm a real sucker for historical sort of policy related work, which goes like a little past Munich, and like find some relatively deep cuts of world and military history. There was a really fun. So we had some good stuff in there. We had, China, Vietnam, 1979. We had the Spanish American War, which like never gets written about. But there was a really great bit in there where you kind of bucketed all of the blunders that that happened when starting wars, and a few of them which I liked the most, which I just wanted to highlight, were excessive reliance on intuition, sorry Napoleon, unwarranted confidence from egotism, hubris, and arrogance, which was like a Hirohito move you guys assigned, and then mental disorder, megalomania / paranoia, which Hitler gets credit for invading the Soviet Union. So I'll leave that one in the show notes if people want to dive in. So Bonnie, I wanted to close a little bit with kind of meditating on the role of FFRDCs in the policy discussion and what they kind of can and can't do relative to your new role working at a sort of brand name Massachusetts Avenue think tank. So what do you what are your kind of reflections on the strengths and the limits of the RANDs and the IDAs of the world?
I went to RAND right after my graduate school, and there could not have been a better place for me to really learn about the PLA and work with some of the world's leading PLA experts, as well as operational military experts and analysts. So RAND, given the fact that we do so much work for the Department of Defense, and the fact that I don't know the actual percentage, but I would imagine over 50% of the RAND DC office has a security clearance, that working in such a world where we have so much access, but also direct connection to the DoD, is just such a great way to be able to plug into the defense community and also be able to do very rigorous year-long works, or sometimes multi-year projects, where you really get to dive deep onto an issue, a topic, and you're working in large teams. So teams could be as small as, 2 or 3, but it can also be as big as 15, 20 people. And when you have big teams that big, you really are looking at a problem from an interdisciplinary approach. So I highly recommend RAND for folks who are really thinking about understanding the PLA and understanding China from the military perspective.
Weaknesses.
Well, so the weakness is if you're doing a year-long project, you're not going to be able to publish it, like tomorrow, right? So you can't, you're not responding to the news cycle, right? You're responding to much larger, deep questions that require that year-long research.
So sort of think tank work contrasted with the stuff folks see out of FFRDCs. What do you think what do you think they bring, and what do you think the challenges that think tanks have, given that the sort of teams and budgets tend to be a few orders of magnitude smaller than the resources that the RANDs of the world have to work with?
Mm-hmm, sure. So what I really love about CSIS is how much we're really out in front of issues. And in some ways, as one of my colleagues told me when I first joined, in some ways, we're trying to comment and shape some of the discussions on key topics, whether that's China, Russia, or other China topics. So, and at CSIS, we're incredibly nimble, right? So say if we wanted to put up on a panel the next day, what the only limits are if we can find the panelists, as well as if we could find appropriate time on our calendars, right? It's incredibly fast. And the real benefit of being a CSIS is we don't have anyone telling us what we can or cannot say. There's very limited review process of our work. It's the trust that, it's our name if we want to publish it. So since it's our name and we're taking credit, we're also taking the blame. So it's not, it's in many ways a vote of confidence in your ability to maintain your own brand. So the difference then with RAND is because so much of our work is for DoD, right? There is, in some ways, we would need to check with our sponsors on whether we can share information as we're working on it. And sometimes the topics are too sensitive, right? Other times, we're doing classified work, so we can't share it publicly. So part of working in the FFRDC is a recognition that you're contributing to this longer term analysis, and you're not out there necessarily shaping the news cycle. You're not aiming for, to be the next top op-ed that someone reads.
Yeah. So I wanted to close on one more thing, Bonnie. You've alluded to the fact that you spend a fair amount of time kind of chatting with mainland scholars. I'm curious if you had a reading list of your top 5 folks, or any advice you would have for me, desperate to bring sort of mainland-based folks onto China Talk, but have strucken out time after time. I wonder if there's any sort of secret button or phrase you think I should include in my interview request emails going forward that might increase my chances.
Oh, I don't know if I have any secret sauce, because I haven't since I've taken over for China Power, I have yet to feature a Chinese guest on my podcast, but I will be featuring one next 2 or 3 weeks from now. Tong Zhao from Carnegie, and my
he's literally I'm gonna run a show with him next week. He's
perfect.
He's literally the only person who's responded to my email. Oh my God, Tong Zhao, 200 points to you.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's and I also do think it is more difficult for our Chinese counterparts to be able to speak as freely nowadays than before. So I guess I would go with the folks who are already speaking publicly, because they are either more willing to take a risk, or they know where the boundaries are, and they're willing to talk despite that.
Sure. And just maybe close with 3 folks who you think people should follow their Weibo's or sort of publication histories.
I'm actually inclined to not mention names, just because I don't know if it's good to be mentioned or bad to be mentioned. It's just such a difficult environment now.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I just want to make another pitch for everyone out there. Someone with better Chinese than me, please start the Chinese language China Talk. This should be happening in my kind of thought is that maybe just doing shows in Chinese might be a little more comfortable for folks. Maybe not. Maybe it's actually even worse. Who knows? Bonnie, I close every show with a song. Do you have any like PLA adjacent songs, or just any song that can like somewhat be related to this show? I don't know if there's like a China Russia song, or you seem incredibly shocked. If you don't want to pick a song, I can just find something. But
as in like you're gonna sing it, or you want me?
Oh my god, no.
it?
I sort of like fade. I like fade us out. I like rip a song from YouTube and then just like put it as outro. It's like outro music.
Huh. Chinese songs. What song that I am a little interested in? I actually don't even know the name of the song.